Look, I'm going to tell you something that's been keeping me up at night. And I don't say that lightly. After 8 years in the Oval Office, I learned to sleep through just about anything. But what Putin just revealed about Trump, it changes everything we thought we knew about their relationship. Now I sat across the table from Vladimir Putin more times than I care to remember. I looked into his eyes, I watched him operate, and I learned something crucial. Putin never says anything by accident. Every word is calculated, every leak is strategic. So, when he recently let slip certain details about his dealings with Donald Trump, details that contradict years of public denials, I had to pay attention, because I've seen this playbook before. I've watched Putin manipulate leaders, exploit weaknesses, and play the long game better than almost anyone on the world stage. Here's what most people don't understand. This isn't just about one revelation. It's about a pattern I witnessed firsthand, a pattern that explains so much of what happened during the 2016 election, the Helsinki summit, and everything that came after. Let's talk about what really happened. It was April 2009, my first G20 summit as president, held in London at the Excel Center. I remember walking through the security corridor that morning, my team briefing me on the day's agenda, and feeling this strange mix of confidence and anxiety. I'd been president for less than 3 months. The financial crisis was in full swing. Banks collapsing, unemployment rising, the whole global economy teetering on the edge. And here I was, about to sit in a room with 20 of the most powerful leaders on Earth, trying to coordinate a response. But I'd prepared for this. I'd spent years studying foreign policy. I understood the theory, the history, the diplomatic protocols. I thought I knew what I was walking into. Then Vladimir Putin arrived. Now let me paint you a picture of how these summits typically work. Leaders arrive roughly on time. There's a carefully choreographed series of handshakes and photo opportunities. Everyone takes their assigned seats, and we get down to business. It's formal, yes, but there's also this underlying sense of collegiality. We're all democratically elected leaders dealing with similar pressures, similar constituencies. Putin didn't play by those rules. He showed up 45 minutes late. Not fashionably late, strategically late. Late enough that everyone noticed. Late enough that the entire room had to pause and recalibrate when he entered. I watched the other leaders' reactions. Some looked annoyed, others looked uncomfortable. A few, and this bothered me, looked almost deferential. I stood to shake his hand. And that's when I got my first real look at him up close. The photographs don't capture it. On camera, Putin looks cold, austere, almost two-dimensional. But in person, there's something else, an intensity, a focus that feels almost predatory. We shook hands. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, professional. And when our eyes met, I tried to do what I always did in these first encounters. Find some human connection, some common ground. I'd done it with Merkel, with Sarkozy, even with leaders I disagreed with. Fundamentally, Putin's eyes were different. They weren't hostile exactly. They were calculating, like he was running some internal assessment, categorizing me, filing away information for later use. There was no warmth, but there was also no obvious animosity, just cold evaluation. "Mr. President," he said through his translator, his voice flat and controlled. President Putin. I replied, "Good to finally meet in person." He nodded once and moved to a seat. The meeting began and we dove into the financial crisis, stimulus packages, banking, regulations, coordinating our monetary policies. I made my case for a unified response, arguing that we needed to act together or risk a global depression. Most leaders nodded along, added their perspectives, built on each other's points. Putin barely spoke for the first hour. When he finally did, it wasn't about the immediate crisis. Instead, he launched into this long commentary about American overreach, about how the current situation was the result of unregulated Western capitalism, about how Russia had been warning about these dangers for years. It wasn't quite a speech. He was too controlled for that. but it was clearly a prepared statement designed to shift the conversation away from solutions and toward blame. I remember glancing at my national security advisor, Tom Donen, who was sitting behind me. He gave me this look that said, "Welcome to dealing with Putin." But here's what really struck me. While Putin was talking, I watched him. I mean, really watched him. And I noticed something that would shape how I understood him for the next 8 years. He wasn't trying to persuade anyone in that room. Think about that for a moment. In any normal negotiation, when you speak, you're trying to convince people. You're looking at faces, gauging reactions, adjusting your argument based on the feedback you're getting. That's politics 101. That's what I'd been doing my entire career. Putin wasn't doing that. He was delivering a message, yes, but his real audience wasn't the people in that room. He was speaking for the cameras, for the Russian media back home, for the historical record. He was checking a box on some longer-term strategy that had nothing to do with whether Germany or France or the United States agreed with him in that moment. When the session broke for lunch, I made a point of approaching him directly. I wanted to test my theory to see if I could find a way through that cold exterior. "President Putin," I said, "I think we have more common ground than our public positions might suggest. The Russian people and the American people both want stability, prosperity, security for their families." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Mr. President, you are young. You believe in what you say. This is admirable. But you will learn that what people want and what nations need are not always the same thing." It was condescending, sure, but it was also revealing. In that one sentence, he told me everything about how he saw the world. People were variables to be managed. Nations were entities with their own logic separate from democratic will. And leaders like him, strong leaders as he saw it, had the responsibility to do what was necessary regardless of popular opinion. I smiled politely and moved on to talk with Angela Merkel, but my mind was racing. That afternoon, we had a smaller breakout session on nuclear arms reduction, one of my key priorities. I'd campaigned on reducing nuclear stockpiles, on moving toward a world without the constant threat of mutual annihilation. I believed in it deeply. I still do. The discussion was technical, focused on verification protocols and warhead counts. Putin engaged more in this session, but again, something felt off. Every time we'd get close to agreement on a framework, he'd introduce a new complication. Not enough to derail the talks entirely, but enough to slow everything down to add layers of complexity. At one point, he insisted on linking nuclear reduction to missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, a complete non sequitur that had nothing to do with the immediate discussion. When I pushed back, he just shrugged and said, "These issues are connected whether you see the connection or not." Later that evening, back in my hotel suite, I called a meeting with my senior staff, Denai McDana, Hillary Clinton via secure video link, Tom Donnellan, and a few others crowded into the room. "All right," I said, loosening my tie and sitting on the edge of the desk. "Give me your honest read on Putin." Hillary spoke first. She dealt with him when she was First Lady and had watched him closely. As a senator, he's KGB to his core. She said, everything is about power, leverage, and long-term positioning. He doesn't think in terms of win-win. He thinks in terms of zero-sum. Tom jumped in. The intelligence community has been tracking his moves for years. He's been systematically consolidating power in Russia, eliminating opposition, controlling the media. He's building an authoritarian state, and he sees the U.S. as the main obstacle to Russian resurgence. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the London skyline. "Here's what worries me," I said. "He's patient. Did you see how he operated today? He's not trying to win individual battles. He's trying to create an environment where he can operate freely while we're distracted by our own problems." Then he asked, "So, what's our strategy?" I turned back to face him. "We engage, but we're clear-eyed. We push for arms reduction because it's in our interest, not because we think he's suddenly going to become a partner. We call out aggression when we see it, and we rebuild our alliances because the only way to counter someone who thinks in decades is to build structures that outlast any single administration. I paused, then added something that I haven't talked about publicly until now. And we watch for how he tries to divide us because that's his real play. He can't beat us militarily or economically. But if he can turn Americans against each other, if he can make us question our own democratic institutions, if he can find leaders who are willing to play his game, I die. Didn't finish the sentence. At the time, it seemed like a distant theoretical concern. That night, alone in my room, I did something I rarely did. I pulled out my old notes from a course I'd taken at Columbia on Soviet history. I reread passages about the Cold War, about how the Soviets had approached ideological competition, about how they'd seen every interaction as part of a broader struggle. Putin wasn't Soviet Russia had changed, evolved, become something different. But the mindset, the strategic patience, the willingness to play a long game while presenting a false front of cooperation that hadn't changed. I put the notes away and tried to sleep, but I kept seeing his eyes, that cold, calculating look, the way he'd studied me like I was a temporary obstacle, someone who would be gone in 4 or 8 years while he planned to be around much, much longer. The next morning on the flight back to Washington aboard Air Force One, I sat with my team going over our next steps. We talked about resetting relations with Russia, about finding areas of cooperation, about being pragmatic. But in the back of my mind, I kept returning to that moment when Putin had called me young, when he'd suggested I'd learn hard lessons about the difference between what people want and what nations need. I remember thinking, he's right that I'm going to learn lessons, but maybe not the ones he expects. Because here's what I understood. Even then, sitting on that plane over the Atlantic, Putin was playing a different game than the rest of us. While we were focused on quarterly economic reports and election cycles and public opinion polls, he was thinking about Russia's place in history, about reversing what he saw as the humiliation of the Soviet collapse, about rebuilding Russian power, not through economic development or democratic reform, but through strategic manipulation and exploitatio. N of Western weaknesses. And the scariest part, I could see exactly how it might work. If he could find the right pressure points, the right vulnerabilities, the right American leader who saw the world in transactional terms rather than values-based terms, he could do serious damage. I had no idea how soon that would become a reality.
November 10th, 2016, 2 days after the election, I woke up that morning in the White House residence with a knot in my stomach that I hadn't felt since election night 2008. Except this time, the anxiety wasn't about my own future. It was about the countries Michelle and I had breakfast together, mostly in silence. What do you say when the person you spent months warning the country about is about to become your successor? When everything you built, every norm you tried to uphold, every alliance you carefully nurtured is about to be handed over to someone who campaigned against all of it. You have to try, Michelle said finally, reading my mind the way she always could. Whatever you think of him, you have to try. She was right. The peaceful transfer of power isn't just a tradition. It's the bedrock of our democracy. It's what separates us from the Putins of the world, from leaders who cling to power or undermine their successors. So regardless of how I felt personally, I had a responsibility. Donald Trump was scheduled to arrive at 11 a.m. My team had prepared a thick binder of materials for the meeting, everything from nuclear codes, protocols to ongoing operations in Syria to the daily intelligence briefing structure. But I'd asked for an hour alone with him first. Just the two of us in the Oval Office, no staff, no cameras, president to president-elect. I spent the morning reviewing my notes, trying to figure out how to approach this. I'd met Trump before, briefly at various events over the years. He'd been cordial enough in that soup. Official way of his, but I'd also watched him campaign,
I'd seen the rallies, the rhetoric, the casual disregard for truth. I'd heard the intelligence reports about Russian interference designed to help him win. And I'd seen how he talked about Putin, the admiration, the strange reluctance to criticize, the repeated suggestions that getting along with Russia would be easy, that he and Putin would have a great relationship. That's what I needed to focus on, not the insults he'd hurled at me during the campaign. Not the birther conspiracy theories he'd promoted for years, not even the policies he'd promised to reverse. The Russia issue was urgent. It was a threat to national security that transcended politics. At 10:55, I got word that his motorcade was approaching. I stood in the Oval Office, straightening my tie, taking deep breaths, trying to center myself. The door opened, and there he was, taller than I expected, his hair catching the light in that strange way it does, his handshake overly aggressive as he pulled me toward him. "Mr. President," he said with that Queen's accent, "this is really something. Beautiful office, really beautiful. Congratulations on your victory," I said, keeping my voice even. "Please have a seat." We sat in the two chairs in front of the fireplace, the same chairs where I'd met with dozens of world leaders, where I'd made decisions about war and peace, where I'd wrestled with the hardest problems imaginable. I started with the traditional elements, the weight of the office, the loneliness of the decision-making, the way the job changes you, humbles you, regardless of how confident you feel going in. He nodded along, but I could tell he wasn't really absorbing it. His eyes kept wandering around the room, taking in the decor, the paintings, the resolute desk behind us. This was a trophy to him. I realized the ultimate prize in a lifetime. Me of competitions. "I want to talk to you about the daily intelligence briefing," I said, trying to anchor his attention. "It's the most important hour of your day. The intelligence community will bring you threats, analysis, ongoing operations. You need to take it seriously." "Oh, I'm a smart guy," he said, waving his hand. I don't need to hear the same thing every day. If something important happens, they can tell me." I felt my jaw tighten. "Donald, these briefings aren't repetitive. The threats evolve daily. The information is time-sensitive. Presidents who skip these briefings miss crucial context." He shrugged. "We'll see." I moved through the binder, hitting the key points. North Korea's nuclear program. He interrupted to tell me he could solve it easily. The Iran nuclear deal. He said it was the worst deal ever made and he'd rip it up. Healthcare. He had a plan that would be much better than Obamacare. Every topic he had a simple answer. Every complex problem he thought he could solve through force of personality or deal-making. Then I got to Russia. "This is critical," I said, leaning forward, making sure he was looking at me. "Vladimir Putin's not your friend. He's not going to be your partner. He is actively working to undermine American democracy, and he's not going to stop just because you're president." Trump's expression changed slightly. A defensiveness crept into his voice. "I've heard good things about Putin. People say he's a strong leader. I think we can work together." "No, listen to me," I said more forcefully than I'd intended. "I've dealt with Putin for 8 years. I've sat across from him at summits. I've negotiated with him on Syria, on Ukraine, on arms control. I know how he operates. He doesn't want cooperation. He wants leverage. He wants to divide NATO, weaken our alliances, and create chaos in Western democracies." I pulled out a folder from the binder. A summary of the intelligence on Russian election interference. "We have clear evidence that Russia interfered in this election. They hacked the DNC. They spread disinformation on social media. They tried to undermine confidence in our electoral process." Trump's face hardened. "I won fair and square. This is just Democrats making excuses. I'm not questioning the legitimacy of your victory," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I'm telling you that Russia attacked our democracy and they're going to keep doing it. This isn't about the election results, it's about national security." He crossed his arms. "Why would Putin do that? What does he get out of it?" And this is where I realized the full scope of the problem. He genuinely didn't understand. He couldn't see past his own ego, his own need to believe that he'd won entirely on his own merits. Putin wants chaos, I explained. He wants Americans fighting with each other instead of standing together. He wants us to question our institutions, our media, our electoral process, because a divided, weakened America can't effectively counter Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, or anywhere else. I told him about Crimea, about how Putin had annexed Ukrainian territory in violation of international law. I explained how Putin had propped up Assad in Syria, creating a refugee crisis that destabilized Europe. I walked him through the pattern of Russian cyber attacks on Estonia, Georgia, and other former Soviet states. He's rebuilding Russian power. I said, not through economic development or democratic reform, but through aggression and information warfare. And he's testing us constantly, looking for weaknesses he can exploit. Trump listened, but I could see him getting impatient. He glanced at his watch, a tell I recognized from years of difficult meetings. "Look," he said finally, "I appreciate the advice, but I'm good with tough guys. I've dealt with plenty of them in business. I know how to negotiate. Maybe what Putin needs is someone who respects strength, who doesn't lecture him about democracy and human rights all the time." I felt something sink inside me. This wasn't just naive. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant, of what was at stake, Donald, I said, and I used his first name deliberately, trying to break through. This isn't a business deal. Putin doesn't think like a CEO. He thinks like a KGB officer. Every interaction is about gathering intelligence, finding leverage, exploiting weakness. If you go into a meeting with him thinking you can charm him or cut a deal, he's going to eat you alive. "We'll see," he said again, standing up. "Maybe I'll surprise you." I stood too, knowing I was losing him, knowing that whatever I said next probably wouldn't matter, but I had to try. "There's one more thing," I said. "Putin is going to test you early within the first few months of your presidency. He's going to do something provocative. Maybe in Syria, maybe in Ukraine, maybe through cyber attacks on our infrastructure. He'll want to see how you respond, whether you're willing to stand up to him or whether you'll back down." Trump nodded absently, clearly ready to move on. "And when that happens," I continued, "you need to be firm, clear consequences, united with our allies. Because if Putin senses weakness, if he thinks he can push you around or manipulate you, it's going to embolden him. Snorts, and not just him. Every authoritarian leader in the world will be watching." "I got it," Trump said. "Strong leader, tough on Putin. Got it." But I could tell he didn't got it. Not really. We walked out of the Oval Office together, and suddenly we were surrounded by staff, by cameras, by the carefully staged optics of the transition. We smiled for the photographers. We made pleasant small talk. We performed the ritual of democratic continuity, but I felt hollow inside. After he left, I sat back down in the Oval Office alone. I looked at the binder. We'd barely gotten through. All those briefings, all that institutional knowledge, all those hard-learned lessons about how the world really works, and I had no confidence that any of it had landed. My chief of staff, Denny McDana, knocked and came in. He could read my face immediately. "That bad?" he asked. I rubbed my eyes. "Denny, I spent 90 minutes with him. I covered everything from the nuclear codes to ISIS to managing the press. But the Russia stuff, I spent at least 20 minutes on Putin alone, maybe 25. I gave him specifics. I showed him intelligence. I explained the pattern of behavior, and he doesn't want to hear it. He thinks I'm exaggerating because I'm bitter about the election. He thinks he's going to be different, that he can handle Putin where I supposedly failed. I don't know which is worse." Denise sat down across from me. "So, what do we do?" I thought about that for a long moment. We continue the investigation into Russian interference. We make sure the intelligence community documents everything. We brief congressional leaders from both parties. We do everything we can to protect the institutions and Trump. "We hope I'm wrong," I said. "We hope that the office changes him, that the briefings eventually get through, that he grows into the job. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. That night, Michelle found me in my study staring at my laptop reading the latest intelligence reports on Russian cyber operations. She put her hand on my shoulder. "You did what you could," she said. "Did I?" I looked up at her. Maybe I should have been more forceful. Maybe I should have brought in the intelligence chiefs, made it a formal briefing instead of just a conversation. Bah. Rack, he wasn't going to listen regardless of how you presented it. You know that she was right. But it didn't make me feel better. Over the next few weeks during the transition period, I made sure my national security team briefed Trump's incoming staff on the Russia threat. We held joint sessions. We shared classified materials. We tried every avenue we could think of, but I kept hearing the same thing back through the grapevine. Trump's team thought we were overreacting. They thought the Russian narrative was a political hit job designed to delegitimize his victory. They weren't taking it seriously. On January 6, 2017, just 2 weeks before Trump's inauguration, I received a classified briefing that would prove my warnings were not only valid, but if anything, understated. The intelligence community had compiled a comprehensive assessment of Russian election interference. It was damning. Putin had personally ordered the campaign. The goal was explicitly to help Trump and hurt Clinton. The operation was multifaceted: cyber intrusion, social media manipulation, contacts with campaign associates. I ordered the intelligence chiefs to brief Trump on this immediately. They did at Trump Tower. I got the readout afterward. He'd been defensive, dismissive. He'd compared the intelligence community to Nazi Germany. He'd suggested the leaks about Russia were worse than the actual Russian interference. I remember sitting in the Oval Office holding that readout, feeling a chill run down my spine. In 2 weeks, I would hand over power to someone who either couldn't or wouldn't see that Russia had attacked our democracy, someone who seemed more concerned about his own ego than national security, someone who, for reasons I couldn't fully understand, refused to acknowledge that Putin was a threat. I pulled out my personal journal, something I'd kept sporadically throughout my presidency, and wrote something I've never shared publicly until now. Today, I briefed my successor on the Russia threat for what may be the last time. He doesn't believe it, or doesn't want to believe it. I fear I'm handing him not just the awesome power of the presidency, but also the keys to a house that's already on fire. And instead of water, he's bringing gasoline. I paused, then added one more line. Putin's going to get inside his head. I'm certain of it now. The only question is how much damage will be done before someone stops it. I closed the journal and looked around the Oval Office, my office, for just a few more days. I'd sat in this room and made the call to get bin Laden. I'd wrestled with the decision to send troops to Afghanistan. I'd passed healthcare reform that expanded coverage to millions. I'd tried imperfectly but earnestly to make the country better. And now I was about to hand it all over to someone who, in my judgment, was fundamentally unprepared for the responsibility and disturbingly susceptible to manipulation by America's most dangerous adversary. I wish I'd been wrong about that, but I wasn't. February 2017, I'd been out of office for less than a month. I was trying to adjust to civilian life, if you can call having Secret Service protection and a staff civilian. Michelle and I were in Palm Springs trying to decompress after 8 intense years. I was writing, reading books.